The story of Joseph is a sweeping saga that spans 13 chapters in the book of Genesis. It begins in chapter 37 with Jacob and his 12 sons and a robe. It is the story of a dreamer and a mover and a shaker. It is also a story of jealousy, hatred, deceit, and betrayal. But most of all, it is a story of God's faithfulness in the midst of human unfaithfulness. Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons, the firstborn of his beloved wife, Rachel, the son of his old age, and the apple of his eye. It was no secret among the sons that Dad liked Joseph the best. Prince Joseph, his half-brothers used to call him. It was kind of cute when he was little, but now he was a cocky 17-year-old, and their father's favoritism was really getting on their nerves. It was bad enough that he would tattle on them when they would lose track of the sheep in the fields. But now he was strutting around in his fancy coat and telling them about his fanciful dreams. "Listen to the dream I had last night," he told them. "We were in the field gathering wheat when all of a sudden my bundle of wheat stood up straight and tall and your bundles of wheat gathered around and bowed down to it." Pretty cool, huh? What do you suppose that means? "It means you're a jerk," his brothers said to him. And they hated him. A couple days later, Joseph couldn't wait to tell them about another dream he had. "We don't want to hear about it," his brothers said. But of course, he told them anyway. "Oh, in this dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars all bowed down to me." Even Father Jacob was offended at this one. He pulled his favorite son aside and scolded him. Are you saying that your mother and I and your 11 brothers will someday bow down to you?" Yet even as he rebuked his son, Jacob could not help but wonder what his son's dreams might mean. Joseph's brothers, on the other hand, had it up to here with their little brother. So they dreamt up their own scheme to get rid of him for good. They were herding the flocks off to a distant region when they came up with a plan. This plan was that when Joseph met up with them, they would grab him, they would throw him into a pit and kill him. And then they could go home and tell their father that wild animals had eaten him. Reuben, the eldest of the brothers, talked some sense into the rest of them. "We can't have our brother's blood on our hands," he said. "But throwing him into a pit? Oh, we could have some fun with that." So they waited and watched. They had no trouble, of course, spotting Joseph as he approached wearing his brightly colored robe. "Here comes the dreamer," one of them said. So they jumped Joseph. They stripped off his robe and they threw him into a pit. And then they sat down to eat their supper. As they ate, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming by on its way to Egypt. Brother Judah said, "I have an idea. Let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. His blood won't be on our hands. We'll have him out of our life for good, and we'll have some extra cash." Now, Reuben was not around for this transaction, so when he returned, he was dismayed to see that the pit was empty. "What have you done with him?" he asked his brothers. "Well, you see, these Ishmaelites were on their way to Egypt, so we sold Joseph to them." "You what?" Reuben asked. "We sold Joseph into slavery. He's well on his way to Egypt now. We'll never have to hear again of his dreams, and we are 20 pieces of silver richer." Alarmed and aghast, Reuben tore his robe, and he said to them, "What are we supposed to tell Dad?" That Joseph was eaten up by wild animals? So they tore Joseph's beautiful coat into shreds. They dipped it in goat's blood, and they came home looking all sad and distraught. "Father, Father," they wailed, "we can't find Joseph. We looked everywhere for him, but he's nowhere to be found. All we found was this torn up, brightly colored robe covered with blood. Whose might it be?" Jacob took the robe and immediately recognized it as Joseph's. Overcome with grief, he fell to the ground and wept. He sat in sackcloth and ashes for many, many days, weeping and fasting. His sons and his daughters and his wives tried to comfort him, but poor Jacob was inconsolable. That could have been the end for Joseph, but the story is far from over. Joseph arrived in Egypt in chains and was sold to a man named Potiphar, who happened to be one of Pharaoh's top officials. But even though Joseph now wore the robe of a slave, he became a very successful man. He became successful because the Lord was with him. Joseph became an overseer in Potiphar's house, running the family's business, bringing prosperity and good fortune to Potiphar's household. Potiphar's wife especially took notice. She became infatuated with this young, smart, and good-looking foreigner who was running the house. She invited Joseph to come to bed with her. He politely refused. She was persistent. Day after day after day, she tried to seduce him. He explained that he had been entrusted with her husband's wealth and property, and that he would not break that trust by committing sin with her. One day she grabbed Joseph by the robe and she demanded, "Lie with me." Joseph ran away, leaving behind his robe that was tightly clenched in her fist. Angered by his refusal at her advances, she accused Joseph of attempting to rape her. And she even had his robe in her chambers as evidence against him. Potiphar, of course, was enraged, and he threw Joseph into prison. And God was with Joseph. Joseph's leadership and management skills were noticed even in prison. And before too long, he was put in charge of all the other prisoners, among them the Pharaoh's chief butler and chief baker. One night, these two prisoners, the butler and the baker, had troubling dreams. Joseph told them, "I know something about dreams, and I know the God who provides interpretation." So they described their dreams to Joseph. First, Joseph interpreted the butler's dream. Within 3 days, Joseph told him, "You will be released from prison and will again be at Pharaoh's side." So Joseph added, "Please remember me when you resume your post, and please speak kindly of me to Pharaoh." "Absolutely," the butler responded. Then Joseph turned to the baker, who was heartened by what the butler had just been told. "I'm so sorry," Joseph said to the baker, "but your dream tells me this: within 3 days you will be hanged." And it was just as Joseph said. 3 days later, the butler was released and was back at the Pharaoh's side, and the baker was hanged. But the butler did not remember his promise to Joseph. In fact, he forgot all about Joseph. And 2 years passed. But God did not forget Joseph. Now even Pharaoh himself was having troubling dreams. He was so troubled by these dreams that he called for his wise men and his magicians to come and interpret these dreams, but they could not do it. And so Pharaoh was even more troubled. Then his butler said, "Hey, that reminds me. I know a guy who's pretty good with dreams." And in no time at all, Joseph was released from prison and found himself standing before the Pharaoh. "I hear you can rightly interpret dreams," the Pharaoh said to him. Joseph humbly replied, "It is not I. It is not I. It is God who provides the interpretation, and God will give you the answer that you seek, O Pharaoh." And so Pharaoh described his dreams. 7 sleek and fat cows were grazing beside the Nile River. And then 7 ugly and thin cows came up beside the river, and they ate up the fat cows. Pretty strange dream. And the second one was very much like it. There were 7 plump and fat grains of wheat that came and were growing profusely. And then along came 7 very thin and blighted grains, and they ate up the 7 healthy grains. Pharaoh explained these to Joseph, and he said, "My wise men, my magicians could not interpret these dreams. Let's see if you can do any better." Without hesitation, Joseph responded, "God has revealed the future to you, O Pharaoh. The 7 fat cows and the 7 full ears of grain represent 7 years of bumper crops which begins this very season. The 7 thin cows and the 7 blighted ears of grain represent 7 years of famine, which will immediately follow the 7 years of abundance. The famine will be severe, and the suffering will be great throughout the land. God gave these dreams to you, O Pharaoh, so you could prepare for what is to come. So this is what you should do, O Pharaoh. You should select a man who is wise and discerning, someone to oversee the production of grain in these 7 abundant years, to store the surplus for the 7 years of famine that will follow." Pharaoh was greatly impressed. He pointed at Joseph and said, "You are that man. You will oversee this project. In fact, you will rule over all of Egypt, being second only to me." And then Pharaoh removed his signet ring and placed it on Joseph's finger and gave him a robe embellished with gold. And so Joseph had authority over all the land of Egypt. And just as God had revealed, there were 7 years of plenty, and Joseph stored up grain in such abundance that it could not even be measured. And just as God had revealed, when those 7 years were over, there was severe famine throughout the land. But in Egypt alone, there was grain and bread. And so all the world started coming to Egypt to buy grain. Back in Canaan, Jacob and his 11 sons were starving. Hearing that there was food in Egypt, Jacob sent his eldest 10 to go to Egypt to buy grain, keeping the youngest, Benjamin, home with him, fearful for his life, this only remaining son of Rachel. And so the sons of Jacob came to Egypt, where they were sent to the royal governor, not knowing or recognizing that this powerful ruler of Egypt was their long-lost brother. Joseph, on the other hand, immediately recognized them. His brothers bowed before him, And Joseph remembered the dreams of his youth, his brother's wheat bowing down before him, 11 stars bowing down to him. And the hurt and the anger caused by his brother's sins against him welled up within his heart. He spoke harshly to them. He accused them of being spies. He caused them to grovel before him. He did send them home with grain, lots of grain, and actually, unbeknownst to them, he also returned the money they brought in with the grain. But this was only after he kept Simeon with him in Egypt as a hostage until they would return with the youngest brother, Benjamin. On their second trip to Egypt, Joseph continued to test his brothers by planting a silver cup in Benjamin's baggage, accusing Benjamin of theft. At that point, brother Judah, stepped forward and begged for Benjamin's life, telling of their father's grief over losing one son and how he would surely die if he were to lose this youngest of his sons. And then Judah offered to give his life for the life of his youngest brother. It was in this show of selfless love that Joseph could no longer hide his true identity. He cleared the room of all of the Egyptian officials and servants, and he wept bitterly in the presence of his brothers. "I am Joseph," he finally said, and then he inquired of his father. His brothers were stunned by this revelation, and they could not speak. Joseph invited them to come closer. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said to them. "I am the one you sold into slavery in Egypt." And they were afraid. "Do not be dismayed or blame yourselves," Joseph said to them. "God sent me here to prepare for the famine and to save the lives of many. So you see, it really was not you who sent me here. God sent me here." Then he embraced his brother Benjamin and wept. And then Joseph kissed all of his brothers, and there was much weeping in this moment of reconciliation and reunion. And then, at the invitation of Joseph and the Pharaoh, Jacob and all his family came from Canaan to Egypt. So Joseph and his old father Jacob were reunited as well. And the family of Israel grew and prospered in Egypt. God had not forgotten the dreamer. God was faithful to the promises he made to Joseph's forefathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, God had a dream too. His dream was to choose and bless this ordinary, unremarkable, and dysfunctional family, that they would be a blessing to every nation. God had a dream to enter our world through this family so that we would be saved from our sinful selves and freed from the powers of death and the devil. And so it came to pass that thousands of years later, another man by the name of Joseph had a dream. "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife," the dreamer was told. "For the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. God is faithful to his promises. God does not forget his promises. God is faithful. God is with us. Amen.